There is one animal killer whales will circle, test, and then leave alone. Not a great white. Not a blue whale calf. A wall of gray heads turned inward, tails fanned outward like a flower of flukes, 40 tons apiece, refusing to break apart. You have been told orcas rule the ocean. They rule the top 100 meters of it. Below that line sits a world they cannot enter, and something down there is louder, deeper, older, and carries a bigger brain. The strange part is not that orcas back off. It is why we ever called them the top. Start with the part that is not in dispute. Orcas are astonishing. They are the most sophisticated cooperative hunters in the sea, and it is not close. In Norway, they herd herring into tight silver balls and stun them with slaps of the tail. In Antarctica, they line up shoulder to shoulder and swim at a flow together, throwing a wave over it to wash a seal off the ice. Off Patagonia, they drive themselves onto a gravel beach on purpose, take a sea lion pup, and thrash their way back into the surf before the water leaves them stranded. Off South Africa, a pair of males learn to open a great white shark, take the oil-rich liver, and leave the rest of the carcass on the seafloor. And the sharks in that area started disappearing from their usual sites afterward. In 2023, one of those males was filmed doing it alone in under 2 minutes on a juvenile white shark. That is a real crown. Nobody is taking it away. But look at where every single one of those hunts happens. The herring ball is near the surface. The wave wash is on ice. The beach attack is on a beach. The shark hunts happen in shallow coastal water off a cape. Every famous orca behavior you can picture, every clip that built the reputation, occurs in a band of water thin enough that a person on a boat can look over the side and watch it happen. That is not an accident of filming. That is the animal's actual working range. The ocean averages around 3,700 meters deep. Think about that number for a second, because most people never do. Not the trenches, not the record-setting holes in the seafloor. The average. If you took all the water on the planet and spread it into one flat sheet, that sheet would be almost 4 kilometers thick. A jetliner cruises at about 10,000 meters. Turn that distance upside down and sink most of it under the waves, and that is the standard, unremarkable, everyday ocean. Now shade in the part where orcas do their work. Tag studies on killer whales in different populations return a consistent picture. Median dive depths land in the range of tens of meters to about 100. Typical dives are short, with median durations around 4 minutes. And in one data set, the longest dive recorded ran a little over 12. Offshore killer whales in the eastern North Pacific were recorded to a maximum of 480 meters. Southern ocean killer whales pushed further, with maxima recorded around 500 and 767 meters, and one adult female was later tracked past 1,000. Those deep numbers are real, and they matter, and I will come back to them because they complicate the story in an interesting way. But they are outliers. They are the exception that got a headline precisely because it was an exception. The routine, the everyday, the way an orca actually spends its life sits in the top 100 meters or so of a column that runs to nearly 4,000. Draw that to scale, and it stops being an abstraction. Take the whole ocean as a vertical bar on your screen. The zone where the sunlight is still strong enough to matter, where photosynthesis happens, where you can see color, where a hunting animal can use its eyes. That is a thin, bright film across the top. On a properly scaled diagram, it is a skin. Below it, the bar just keeps going and going in flat black for a distance that would swallow every skyscraper ever built, stacked end to end. The orca lives in the skin. So here is the first uncomfortable idea, and it is not really about whales at all. It is about us. We handed out the title of apex predator of the ocean, based on what we could see from the deck of a boat. We ranked an entire planet's worth of water using the only stretch of it we can film, without spending a fortune. The animal that won that ranking is the animal that hunts in daylight, at the surface, near coastlines, in front of cameras, in weather we can tolerate, at depths a drone can look down into. You do not have to invent a conspiracy to explain that. The bias is physical. Sunlight penetrates seawater badly. Below about 200 meters, there is not enough light left to support photosynthesis at all. Below 1,000, for practical purposes, there is nothing. Cameras need light. Light needs either the sun or a machine carrying its own power supply into a crushing environment. Every hour of footage from below that line costs money, ship time, and engineering, and it produces a narrow cone of illumination in an otherwise total dark. So the ocean we know is the ocean we can light, and this is where the reputation problem starts to bite, because the orca's dive limit is not a preference. It is arithmetic. An orca is a mammal. It breathes air. Everything it does underwater is financed by a single lungful and whatever oxygen it has stashed in its blood and muscle before it left the surface. That budget is finite, and every meter of descent spends it in two ways at once. There is the oxygen burned by swimming down. Then there is the oxygen that will be burned swimming back up, which has to be reserved in advance because an animal that runs out of air at 400 meters does not get a second chance. That constraint shapes the hunt before the hunt begins. If your working depth is shallow, your prey has to be shallow too. Fish that school near the surface, seals that must come up to breathe and haul out on ice or sand, sharks that patrol shelf water, whale calves that cannot yet dive deep and cannot yet outrun anything. The orca did not choose spectacle. Spectacle is what hunting looks like when it has to happen in the lit zone, at high speed, with air running out, in the same layer of water where our cameras already are. Reputation followed the light. Now flip the frame, because this is where the story stops being about orcas and starts being about the thing we ranked below them. If the surface is a skin, then more than 95% of the ocean's livable volume sits underneath it. Not empty, not a wasteland. Volume, habitat. The largest continuous living space on the planet, and the largest by an enormous margin. And it is a space no orca has ever hunted in as a way of life. That raises a question somebody should have asked long before anyone crowned anything. What is down there? And more to the point, does anything down there hunt? The answer is yes. And the hunter is not a monster from a poster. It is an animal you have seen 100 times in a children's book, drawn as a friendly gray blob with a square head, usually being harpooned, usually cast as the victim. In almost every story we tell about the ocean, the sperm whale is prey. Prey for whalers, prey for orcas, prey for the giant squid in the museum diorama, though we will get to how badly that one is misread. Here is the thing about that gray blob. It is the largest toothed predator alive on Earth right now, and nothing else with teeth is close. A big male runs to 16 meters and beyond, and there are historical whaling accounts of larger, though those numbers were taken by men with a financial interest in a big fish story and should be treated carefully. 40 tons is a reasonable working figure for a mature male. Females are considerably smaller, around 11 meters, which turns out to matter later in ways that are not obvious yet. Set that beside an orca. A large male killer whale reaches about 9 meters and somewhere around 6 tons. That is a serious animal. It is also, next to a bull sperm whale, roughly the difference between a family car and a loaded semi. Except size is the least interesting thing about it. And if the story stopped there, it would be a boring story. Orcas kill things larger than themselves constantly. They take blue whale calves. There is documented predation on animals many times an orca's mass. Bulk alone does not protect you from a coordinated pack of intelligent predators. If size were the answer would be dull, and we would be done. Size is not the answer. Depth is the beginning of the answer. And depth is where the comparison stops being a comparison and starts being two animals living in two different worlds that happen to share a surface. Because while the orca is working the skin, the sperm whale is doing something that, on paper, reads like a physiological impossibility. It takes one breath, it turns its head down, and it leaves. Not for a minute, not for 4 minutes. It leaves for the better part of an hour into water with no light in it, under a weight of water that would finish you before you understood what was happening. And it does this not once, not as a stunt, but as its job, over and over, all day, every day, for 60 years or more. And the first thing you should understand about that dive is that it is not a dive at all in any sense you would recognize. It is a commute. The tag data on sperm whales is where the picture sharpens. Foraging dives commonly run in the neighborhood of 45 minutes, with recorded ranges spanning roughly 14 minutes at the short end to over an hour at the long, and reports of dives approaching 2 hours in some accounts. Between those dives, the surface interval is short, on the order of 9 minutes at the top, then back down. Read that again with the orca numbers still in your head. The orca's typical dive is about 4 minutes. The sperm whale's rest period between dives is more than twice that. Depths follow the same pattern. Studies across different regions put average maximum dive depths in the range of 600 to 1,000 meters, with regional averages recorded near 985 meters in the Atlantic, 644 in the Gulf of Mexico, and 827 in the Ligurian Sea. Individual dives have been recorded past 2,000 meters. The deepest figures reported for the species approach 3,000, though the very deepest claims come from older or indirect evidence and are best treated as the upper edge of what we think is possible rather than a routine number. Take the conservative version. Take the boring, well-supported, middle-of-the-road version. A sperm whale's ordinary working depth still starts roughly where the orca's all-time record ends. That is not an advantage. That is a different category of animal. And it creates the problem that the rest of this whole story hangs on, because getting down is not actually the hard part. Anything heavy sinks. The hard part is being alive when you arrive, being able to hunt when you get there, and having enough left to make it back to air. 3 problems. Every one of them should be fatal. And the ways this animal solved them are stranger than the depth itself. Consider what happens to a body at 1,000 meters. Pressure in the ocean climbs by roughly 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth. At 100 meters, where an orca does most of its living, the pressure is around 11 times what you feel standing on a beach. Uncomfortable, survivable, the domain of technical divers with the right gas mixes. At 1,000 meters, it is over 100 atmospheres. At 2,000, it is over 200. That is not a number that scales with intuition. That is the weight of 2 kilometers of seawater sitting on every square centimeter of skin, pressing inward from every direction at once, with no gap and no pause. Solids and liquids barely care. Water does not compress much, and a body that is mostly water does not either. Gas is the killer. Gas compresses, and anything holding gas gets squeezed until it is not holding gas anymore. A mammal is full of gas spaces: lungs, airways, sinuses, middle ears. Take a set of human lungs to 1,000 meters, and they do not gently shrink. They implode, and the blood vessels lining them tear, and the chest cavity fills. That is the end of the story, and it happens fast. So the sperm whale does something counterintuitive before it goes anywhere. It empties out. Deep-diving whales exhale most of the air in their lungs before descending. Figures around 90% are commonly cited for sperm whales, which sounds like the exact wrong move for an animal about to spend 45 minutes without breathing. You would expect it to gulp air like a free diver on the surface, pack the lungs, take everything it can. It does the opposite, and the reason is that lung air is a liability down there, not an asset. 2 liabilities, in fact. The first is mechanical. Less air in the chest means less to crush. The rib cage of a deep diving whale is built to fold rather than resist. Flexible, hinged in ways ours is not. So instead of the chest fighting the ocean and losing, it collapses in a controlled way, and the remaining air is squeezed out of the delicate alveoli and up into the reinforced tubing of the trachea and airways, where nothing important can rupture. The second liability is chemical, and it is the one that kills human divers. Under pressure, nitrogen from breathed air dissolves into blood and tissue, come up too fast, and it comes out of solution as bubbles. In your joints, in your spinal cord, in your brain. The bends. A whale doing dozens of deep dives a day, every day for decades, with a 9-minute break between them, should be a walking case study in decompression injury. It solves the problem at the source. If the air is squeezed out of the gas-exchanging surfaces before the deep part of the dive, very little nitrogen gets into the blood to begin with. You cannot get bubbles from gas you never absorbed. There is an obvious hole in that. If the lungs are empty, where's the oxygen for the next 45 minutes? Not in the lungs, in the meat. Sperm whale muscle carries myoglobin at concentrations that are extreme even among diving mammals. Myoglobin is the protein that binds oxygen inside muscle tissue, and it is the reason red meat is red. Load a muscle with enough of it, and the tissue stops looking red and starts looking almost black. That is what deep diving whale muscle looks like. It is not a color, it is a fuel gauge. The animal is not carrying its air supply in a balloon in its chest. It is carrying it dissolved through its entire body, in the blood, and locked into the muscle it is about to swim with. Then it shuts down everything that is not essential. Heart rate drops, bradycardia, and the degree of the drop scales with how long the dive is going to be, which is itself a strange detail worth sitting with because it implies the animal has some sense of the dive it is committing to before it makes it. Blood vessels in the periphery clamp down. Circulation to skin, to the gut, to muscle that can run on its own local oxygen store gets throttled. What blood keeps moving goes where it must: heart, brain. Line those up as a sequence, and you can see the logic. Exhale, so there is nothing to crush and nothing to dissolve. Let the chest fold instead of fight. Carry the oxygen in the tissue instead of in air. Slow the heart so the reserve lasts. Send what is left to the organs that die first without it. Then sink into a black column of water for 45 minutes and go to work. Every one of those is a solution to a problem the orca simply never has to solve, because the orca does not go where those problems exist. And here is the part that is easy to skip past. Getting down is cheap. A sperm whale's body is dense, and it can descend efficiently, letting gravity do a share of the work, gliding through stretches of the descent, rather than actively swimming. There is a long-running discussion in the literature about whether the enormous oil-filled organ in the head plays a role in buoyancy control, the idea being that cooling the wax could increase its density and help the animal sink. Warming it could help the animal rise. That hypothesis has been argued for decades and it is not settled. Sound production is the function best supported by the anatomy and the recordings. Buoyancy and thermal roles remain proposed, contested, and unresolved. And anyone who tells you flatly that the sperm whale's head is a ballast tank is stating a hypothesis as a fact. What is not contested is the direction of the energy problem. Down is the easy half, up is the bill. 1,200 meters of vertical swimming, with a depleted oxygen store carrying whatever it just caught, in a body that weighs as much as a house. And when it surfaces, it does not get to rest properly. It gets 9 minutes. 9 minutes to blow off carbon dioxide, reload the blood and muscle with oxygen, clear the metabolic debt from an hour of near anaerobic work, and then turn its head down and do it again. That is the shape of a sperm whale's day. Dive, hunt, climb, gasp, repeat. The tag records show individuals spending the large majority of their time doing exactly this, with deep foraging dives making up the overwhelming bulk of the day. And here is where most people have the whole comparison backwards. The orca is the athlete, fast, explosive, powerful, the fastest of the two by a wide margin, capable of bursts that a sperm whale could never produce. The sperm whale is not an athlete. It is an endurance machine running a shift that never really ends, in an environment that is actively trying to kill it. On a fuel supply, it has to ration by the minute. And it does this to find food that no one else in that size class can reach. Now the next problem, and this is the one that should stop the whole enterprise cold, it is completely dark down there. Not dim, not moody. There is a zone people talk about called the twilight zone, roughly 200 to 1,000 meters, where a vanishing trace of surface light still filters through, enough that some animals keep large eyes to catch it. Below that, in the zone from 1,000 meters down, sunlight is gone. Fully gone. The only photons in that water are the ones living things make themselves, and those are brief, faint, and usually a signal rather than a floodlight. The sperm whale's working depth straddles the bottom of the twilight and the top of the true dark. Its prey lives in and below that boundary. So how do you hunt something in a place where your eyes do not work? Sperm whales have eyes. Their eyes are unremarkable in size for an animal that big and are not built like the enormous light-gathering optics you see in some deep-sea fish and in the giant squid. That absence is itself a clue. Evolution does not maintain expensive equipment that is not paying rent. If the eye were the primary hunting tool at depth, the eye would be enormous. It is not. The primary tool is sound, and the way this animal uses sound is not a modest adjustment to a mammal body plan. It is the single most extreme piece of biological engineering in the vertebrate world, and calling the front of a sperm whale a head is a category error. That block on the front is not a head. It is an instrument, and the animal is built behind it. Look at a sperm whale in profile, and the proportions are wrong in a way your brain notices before you can articulate it. The forehead is a squared-off, blunt-fronted mass that runs roughly a third of the animal's total length. The lower jaw is a narrow rod of bone slung underneath, almost delicate by comparison, hung with conical teeth. The eyes are set far back, past the point where you expect a face to be. The blowhole is not centered on top like it is on nearly every other whale. It is shoved forward and to the left, sitting off-axis at the front left corner of that enormous block. Nothing about that arrangement is decorative. Every strange thing in that list exists because the animal's face was converted into a sound cannon, and the rest of the skull had to get out of the way. Inside that block are two large oil-filled compartments. The upper one is the spermaceti organ, a case of waxy oil that gave the species its name and gave the whaling industry its fortune. Beneath it sits a second structure called the junk, a stack of lens-like bodies of fat and oil separated by sheets of connective tissue. Together, these two compartments make up an enormous fraction of the animal. Estimates put the forehead complex at up to a quarter of body mass, and understanding what they are for took a long time and is still not entirely finished. Here is the mechanism as the anatomy and the recordings describe it, and it is worth walking through slowly, because when you see how the pieces sit together, the whole animal snaps into focus. At the front of the block, near the tip of the nose, sits a pair of structures that old whalers and early anatomists named the monkey lips. The clinical term is phonic lips. They are exactly what the name suggests, a pair of tissue flaps that can be slammed shut. The whale drives air from its nasal passage through them, and they snap. That snap is the source. Everything after it is shaping. The pulse from that snap does not fire forward. It fires backward into the spermaceti organ and travels the length of that oil-filled case toward the rear of the skull. At the back, it meets an air sac pressed against the front face of the skull. Sound reflects almost perfectly at a boundary between tissue and air, so the pulse bounces. It comes forward again, and on the way, it is directed down into the junk, the stacked lens structure below. The junk focuses it, and the pulse leaves the front of the animal as a tight, forward-aimed beam. The whole assembly has been modeled as a bent horn, a sound path folded back on itself to fit 10 meters of acoustic pathway into an animal that has to keep swimming. That is why the blowhole is displaced to the left front corner. The left nasal passage stayed a breathing tube. The right one was converted into machinery. The face was rebuilt around the instrument, and breathing got whatever real estate was left over. And now the number, because the number is the reason any of this matters. The loudest sperm whale clicks measured come in at around 230 decibels, referenced to 1 micropascal at 1 meter. That is the loudest sound any animal on this planet has been recorded making. Decibels underwater are not the decibels on your phone's noise app, and comparing them directly to sounds in air is a trap. The reference pressures are different, and water carries sound differently than air does. Converted into rough air equivalent terms, that click lands somewhere in the range of 170 to 180 decibels, which puts it above a jet engine at takeoff, in the territory of standing beside the muzzle of a large caliber gun as it fires. There is discussion about whether a click at close range could physically stun or disorient something in front of it. That idea gets stated as fact far too often. It is a hypothesis, and it is not established. What is established is the output, and the output is absurd. And now the crucial point, the one that turns a fun fact into a survival mechanism. The sperm whale is not shouting. It is looking. Every click goes out and hits things, water, particles, bodies. A fraction of that energy comes back. The whale reads the returning echo. How long it took, how strong it is, what shape it arrived in. And from that builds a picture of what is in front of it, in water, where light has not reached for 1,000 meters. It hunts by listening to the shape of its own noise coming back off a squid. That is why the click has to be that loud. This is the part that gets skipped. Sound spreads out as it travels, losing intensity with distance, and it loses intensity again on the return trip. To detect a small, soft-bodied, non-reflective animal at range in the deep, the outgoing pulse has to be violent, because what comes back will be a whisper. The volume is not aggression, it is range. Loudness buys distance. Distance buys detection. Detection buys a meal in a place where meals are scarce. And scarcity is the entire governing rule of the deep sea. And there is a second reason the number is so extreme, which is that the sound is not being sprayed in all directions. Measurements of the three-dimensional pattern of sperm whale clicks show a highly directional beam, energy concentrated forward into a narrow cone, rather than radiating outward like a bell. That focusing is what the bent horn is for. Sound that goes sideways is sound that finds nothing and never comes back. Packing the output into a tight forward beam means almost all of the energy is spent in the one direction that could return an answer, which is why the on-axis intensity is so enormous. The whale is not shouting into a room. It is running a searchlight. The consequence of a searchlight, though, is that you only see where you aim, and the animal has to sweep. That reframes what a sperm whale is physically doing on the way down. It is not simply falling. It is descending with its head under control, orienting that beam through the water column, sampling a volume the way you would sweep a torch across a dark warehouse, a slice at a time. Never the whole room at once. A meal in the deep is a small, soft object somewhere inside a cubic kilometer of black water. The only way to cover that volume is in pieces, fast enough to matter, from an animal on a clock. There is a leftover from all this focusing that turns out to be a gift to science, and it is the kind of detail that makes the whole animal feel like a machine somebody designed. The pulse produced by the phonic lips does not exit cleanly in one go. Some of the energy bounces back and forth inside the head between the reflective surfaces at either end of the spermaceti organ before it escapes. So, a single click, recorded on a hydrophone, arrives not as one spike, but as a series of decaying pulses, spaced by the time it takes sound to make a round trip through the organ. That spacing is a ruler. The interval between those internal pulses is set by the length of the spermaceti organ, and the length of the spermaceti organ scales with the size of the whale, which means that from a recording alone, no sighting, no photograph, no contact of any kind, researchers can estimate how big the animal was that made the sound. An animal a kilometer down in total darkness that no one has seen, measured by the echo rattling around inside its own head. Consider the alternative. A whale that could only detect prey at 10 meters would have to physically sweep the volume of water it needed to search. At depth, on a limited oxygen budget, with 45 minutes of usable time, sweeping is fatal. It cannot afford to search. It has to scan. Orcas echolocate too. They are good at it. Their clicks are used to find and discriminate prey, and resident populations can pick out individual fish species by echo. Nobody should sell that short. The difference is scale and purpose. The Orcas biosonar is an instrument for a well-lit or dim environment, working over short ranges, supported by excellent eyesight, in a place where the animal can also just look. The sperm whales is the only sense that works, in a place where nothing else is available, over ranges that require the loudest sound in the natural world to close. One is a tool. The other is the entire reason the animal has the shape it does, and that raises the question that the loudness itself demands. What is worth building a face like that to find? The diet is where this turns stranger than the anatomy. The sperm whale eats squid. That sounds almost anticlimactic after everything above, and this is exactly where most tellings of this story go wrong, because they picture the poster, the whale and the giant squid, locked together, tentacles wrapped around the head, the great battle of the deep. Look at the actual evidence, and the picture is different and honestly better. The evidence comes from stomachs, and specifically from beaks. Squid bodies are soft and digest fast. Their beaks are hard, chitinous, parrot-like, and they resist digestion long enough to accumulate. So when a sperm whale strands and is examined, its stomach can hold a catalog of what it has been eating. In one study of 3 sperm whales stranded in the Bay of Biscay, researchers pulled hundreds of beaks representing 19 separate cephalopod species, 17 squids, plus a 7-armed octopus and a vampire squid. Giant squid beaks show up in these collections. So do the beaks of dozens of other species, most of which are not giant at all. The overwhelming majority of what a sperm whale eats is medium-sized, deep-water squid. Not monsters. Squid you have never heard of, in numbers that are hard to hold in your head. And that changes what the animal actually is. The image of the epic duel makes it sound like a specialist gladiator. The evidence makes it something far more unsettling. A systematic industrial harvester of the mid-water, working a resource so large that the estimates for its scale are genuinely difficult to believe. Older work put total global food consumption by sperm whales on the order of 100 million tons a year. Other estimates have placed cephalopod consumption in a range from roughly 96 million up to 320 million tons annually. Those numbers are estimates built on population figures, energetic requirements, and diet composition. And every one of those inputs carries real uncertainty, so treat the range as a range and not a measurement. But even the low end of it put sperm whale predation in the same conversation as the entire global fishing industry's annual catch. That is what the loudest sound in nature is for, not duels. Bulk. Now the sucker scars, because everyone brings them up and the honest answer is more interesting than the myth. Sperm whales, particularly large males, often carry circular scars on the head and body consistent with squid suckers, and large squid have hooks or toothed sucker rings that can cut skin. Those marks are real. What they mean is where it gets careful. A scar tells you there was contact, and that the contact was rough enough to leave a mark. It does not tell you who was hunting whom, whether it was a fight or a prey animal thrashing during capture, or how the encounter ended. The reasonable reading is that they are evidence of struggle during predation, not evidence of a duel between equals. A squid fighting for its life against a 40-ton predator that found it with sound is still, in the end, dinner. The whale is not battling the deep. It is farming it. And that is where the real comparison starts to tilt, because it exposes something about the orca that the highlight reel does not. We say orcas are generalists. Killer whales as a species eat fish, sharks, rays, seals, sea lions, penguins, seabirds, dolphins, porpoises, and whales, up to and including the calves of the largest animals that have ever lived. The species menu is the broadest of any marine mammal. On paper, that looks like the ultimate insurance policy. Look at any actual population and the insurance policy evaporates. Killer whales are divided into ecotypes, distinct forms that differ in body markings, size, vocal dialect, social structure, genetics, and above all, in what they eat. In the Salish Sea alone, there are 3 ecotypes sharing the same water that do not interbreed. Resident orcas eat fish. Transients eat marine mammals. They live side by side, speak differently, avoid each other, and do not swap menus. And the specialization runs deeper than preference. Southern resident killer whales eat Chinook salmon, not salmon generally. Chinook specifically, at a level that is startling when you see it written down. Studies of their seasonal diet put Chinook at roughly half their intake in fall, rising to 70 or 80% in midwinter and early spring, approaching nearly all of it in spring. That population is endangered. Their Chinook are in trouble, and they are swimming through water containing other fish. Be careful here, because this is a place where the story gets oversold. It is not established that a starving resident orca would refuse to eat anything else. There is evidence they take other salmon species, chum and coho among them, when Chinook are scarce, and they will scavenge and take other fish. The honest framing is not that they cannot switch. It is that they do not switch readily, that their intake stays overwhelmingly dominated by a single prey species even as that species declines, and that researchers studying them consider a broad dietary shift unlikely rather than impossible. Extreme specialization on specific prey is one of the most consistently documented features of killer whale populations, and it is transmitted culturally. Calves learn what food is by watching their mothers hunt it. That is the trap. And it is worth naming precisely because it inverts the usual assumption about what intelligence and culture buy you. Culture teaches a young orca what counts as food. That teaching produces specialists, and specialists are devastatingly effective. A pod that has spent generations refining one technique on one prey species will outcompete a jack-of-all-trades every time the prey is present. That efficiency is why the technique spreads and hardens. It becomes identity, the dialect, the social group, the hunting method, and the food all bound together into one package that gets handed down. Then the prey declines. And the same cultural machinery that made the population lethally efficient now holds it in place. The knowledge of how to hunt something else was never acquired because there was never a reason to acquire it. The behavior is not stored in a gene that mutation can revise on a useful timescale. It is stored in the group, in what mothers show calves. And rewriting it means unlearning the thing that defined the population. The flexibility is real at the species level, and thin at the level of any actual animal. The orca that is starving is not a generalist. It is a Chinook specialist in water without enough Chinook. Now hold that against the sperm whale's food problem and the contrast is almost unfair. The sperm whale's prey lives everywhere. Deep-water cephalopods are distributed through the midwater of every major ocean basin. They are not tied to a river system that can be dammed, a spawning ground that can be logged, a coastline that can be developed, or an ice edge that can melt. They are a diffuse, planet-wide, continuously replenished biomass sitting in the largest habitat on Earth, and almost nothing else that size can reach them. That is exactly why sperm whales are found almost everywhere. Their range covers deep water in essentially all the world's oceans, from near the ice edges to the tropics. The global population estimate that gets cited most often put the species at roughly 360,000 animals around the year 2000, and that figure carries substantial uncertainty. The coefficient of variation attached to it is large, which is a statistician's way of saying it is a reasonable guess and not a census. Later work has revisited the number and the post-whaling trend. Nobody has counted them. You cannot count something that spends most of its life a kilometer down, but the geography is not in doubt. Put an orca range map beside a sperm whale range map, and you get two different kinds of picture. The orca map looks like a species with global distribution, which it is. Killer whales occur in every ocean. Zoom in, and it fractures into a mosaic of populations, each tied to particular prey, particular waters, particular seasonal patterns, most of them numbering in the hundreds or low thousands, many genetically and culturally isolated from their neighbors who are swimming a few kilometers away. The sperm whale map is one continuous smear across the deep water of the world. So we have arrived somewhere uncomfortable for the standard ranking. The animal with the reputation for adaptability is locked into narrow prey by its own culture and fragmented into small, isolated populations. The animal we cast as the lumbering victim feeds on the single largest accessible prey reserve on the planet and lives in all of it. None of which answers the obvious objection, and it is a good objection. Orcas do not need to eat squid. They need to eat, and there is 40 tons of meat swimming around the same ocean, breathing at the surface twice an hour, in family groups that include calves. Orcas kill blue whale calves. They kill adult sea lions and sharks. They have taken on animals far outside their own weight class and won repeatedly. So why is the sperm whale not a staple? Because of what the sperm whales do when the orcas arrive, and it is the single most alien piece of behavior in this entire story. Picture the standard orca attack, because the standard attack is the whole reason they win. Killer whales do not brawl, they isolate. Against a gray whale mother and calf, the pod works for hours, sometimes most of a day, doing nothing but separating the two. They wedge between them. They exhaust the mother. They block the calf's path to the surface and drown it. Against a herd, they cut one animal out and away from the rest. Against a school of fish, they compress it and take from the edge. Every one of those tactics depends on producing an individual that is alone. The sperm whale response is to make that impossible. When a group of sperm whales is threatened, they come together and turn. The animals gather into a tight cluster with their heads pressed toward the center and their tails pointing out in every direction like the spokes of a wheel. Whalers described it. Researchers call it the Marguerite Formation or the rosette, after the flower it resembles from above. Look at it from directly overhead and the geometry is immediately obvious. From every direction of approach, an attacker sees the same thing, a tail. Not a flank, not a calf, not a soft belly, not an isolated animal at the edge. A wall of flukes, each one attached to several tons of muscle, each one capable of a strike that would break bones in an animal that weighs 6 tons. Inside that ring, in the protected center, go the calves and the wounded. Stop and look at what has actually been engineered here, because it is not a fight formation. It is a refusal. The Orca strategy is not primarily about strength. It is about producing isolation and then exploiting it with numbers. The rosette does not try to outfight the Orcas. It removes the precondition. There is no individual to cut out, because the group has stopped being a set of individuals and become one object with an armored perimeter and a soft, defended interior. There is a variant sometimes described in the older literature where the whales face outward instead. Heads out, jaws available, tails in. Which orientation gets used and why is not fully pinned down, and different accounts describe different arrangements under different circumstances. The heads-in version is the one most often documented in the modern observations. What matters is the principle, rather than the exact geometry. Close ranks, present a hard face in all directions, and put the vulnerable in the middle. And here is the micro detail that turns this from an interesting behavior into something harder to look away from. When the formation is broken and an individual is dragged out, other sperm whales have been observed leaving the safety of the rosette to go get them. 1 or 2 animals will break from the ring, expose themselves to attack, flank the isolated whale, and steer it back into the formation. That is not instinct filed under self-preservation. That is an animal accepting a share of the risk to recover a member of the group, and it was recorded happening under sustained attack. Now run the economics from the orca's side, because orcas are not romantics, and this is where the standoff actually comes from. A hunt is an investment. It costs time, energy, and risk of injury. And in the ocean, an injury is often a slow death sentence. A predator only takes a target if the expected return justifies that spend. That is why orcas take calves, why they take the liver of a shark and abandon the rest, why they will spend 6 hours drowning a gray whale calf and then feed selectively on the parts worth having. A group of adult sperm whales in a rosette offers an appalling ratio. Enormous prey, yes, but distributed among animals that will not separate, defended by flukes that can shatter a rib cage, and surrounding any hard-won opening with reinforcements. The payoff is uncertain. The cost is high and immediate. So the pod does what an intelligent predator should do. It probes, it circles, it tests for a gap. And when the gap does not appear, it leaves. To a camera, that reads as fear. It is not. It is arithmetic. And it is one of the smartest things an animal can do. But it does mean something specific for the rankings. And it is the thing nobody says out loud. The apex predator of the ocean has a category of animal. It routinely declines to attack. In its own hunting range. At the surface, where all its advantages apply. One question is left hanging, and it is the one that makes this whole standoff worth telling. Has it ever failed? Yes, and the account of it is the most important correction in this entire comparison. Because for a long time, the scientific position was close to the opposite. Sperm whales were widely considered essentially immune to predation. The reasoning was sound. They are enormous. They travel in defended groups. They have a documented collective defense. They spend most of their lives at depths no predator follows them into. Put those together, and you get an animal with no realistic natural enemy, and that is what the literature broadly assumed. Then, in October 1997, roughly 130 kilometers off the coast of Central California, observers watched a herd of around 35 killer whales attack a pod of 9 sperm whales, and they watched it for 4 hours, What was recorded during those 4 hours dismantled the immunity assumption, and it also revealed something about how orcas actually work that is more disciplined than the highlight reel suggests. The sperm whales formed the rosette, heads in, tails out, exactly as described. The orcas did not charge it. Adult females, some of them with calves alongside, attacked in waves of 4 or 5 animals at a time, using what was described as a wound and withdraw approach. Move in, inflict damage, pull back, let the next wave come. Repeat for hours. Understand what that does to a defensive formation. The rosette is a static structure. It is strong against a single decisive assault, and it costs the sperm whales energy to hold. Waves of attackers rotating in and out mean the defenders never get a break, and the attackers do. Damage accumulates on one side and only on one side. It is a siege, run by relays, on an opponent who has to keep breathing. The adult male killer whales did not participate for most of it. They stood off and waited, which reads as strange until you consider what a large male orca represents in that situation. The heaviest weapon in the group and the most expensive one to get injured. Sending him into a wall of flukes early would risk the pod's biggest asset before the defense was softened. He went in at the end. One adult male charged and killed a sperm whale that was by then seriously wounded and had been separated from the group. One sperm whale was killed and eaten. The rest were left seriously, and in the assessment of the observers, possibly mortally wounded. That is the record. Not a legend, not a documentary reconstruction, not an unverified story from a whaling captain. A published observation, with numbers, over 4 hours. That also documented the sperm whales attempting to rescue an isolated individual by leaving the formation to escort it back in. The immunity idea died there, and any version of this story that tells you orcas cannot kill sperm whales is telling you something the evidence contradicts. Sit with why that makes the comparison more interesting rather than less. If sperm whales were untouchable, the standoff would be boring. A wall is a wall. What the 1997 observation shows is that the defense is not a wall. It is a cost. 35 killer whales, 4 hours of coordinated, staged, disciplined effort, adult females taking damage in rotation, calves present, the largest male held in reserve until the end. All of that produced one dead sperm whale from a group of 9. Now price that hunt against the alternatives available to a pod of 35 orcas in the Eastern Pacific. 4 hours is an enormous investment. Every wave carried the risk of a fluke strike. The rest of the pod that was not eating still had to eat that day and the next. And the return was a single carcass split among a large group. Compare that with a seal on a beach, or a school of fish, or a lone calf. The math is not close. That is why predation on adult sperm whales is documented but rare. Rarity is not a failure of the evidence. Rarity is the evidence. It tells you the price is high enough that even the ocean's best predators mostly decline to pay it. There is a real question underneath this that we cannot fully answer, and it is worth keeping open rather than papering over. Do orcas avoid adult sperm whales because they have calculated that it is not worth it, or simply because sperm whales are not part of the prey culture that a given population learned? Those are different explanations with the same outward result. A transient orca pod that has spent generations hunting seals may pass a sperm whale group without registering it as food at all. The same way a resident pod swims through seals it never touches. The answer probably differs by population, and pretending we know it in general would be inventing certainty that does not exist. What is not ambiguous is the pattern of who gets attacked. Where predation on sperm whales is documented, the targets skew heavily toward females and immature animals. Groups of females with calves, smaller animals, animals that can be separated. Large mature males are a different proposition. And this is where a size difference that seemed like trivia earlier becomes the whole point. Female sperm whales run around 11 meters. A mature bull runs to 16 and beyond, and can be roughly 3 times a female's mass. That is not a modest difference between the sexes. It is one of the largest size disparities between males and females of any mammal. And bulls, unlike females, are frequently alone. Adult male sperm whales leave the social groups they were born into and spend much of their lives in colder, higher latitude waters, often solitary or in loose associations, returning toward the tropics to breed. A solitary animal is exactly the target profile a predator that specializes in isolation should want. There is no rosette to break. There is no group to fight through. The isolation is already done for them. They still, overwhelmingly, do not take it. So there is a question here the surface reputation never prepares you for. If the defense is a formation, and a lone bull has no formation, what exactly is stopping a pod of orcas from taking 16 meters of unaccompanied, unprotected meat? The answer is sitting on the front of the animal, and it is the same structure we have already been talking about. That block of oil and connective tissue is not only an acoustic instrument. There is a serious argument, supported by engineering-style modeling, that it is also a weapon. Start with the history, because the history is what made anyone ask the question. In November 1820, in the middle of the Pacific, more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest land, the Nantucket whale ship Essex was struck by a large male sperm whale. According to the account written by the first mate, Owen Chase, the whale rammed the ship, turned, came back, and struck a second time, opening the hull badly enough that the Essex went down within hours. 20 men got into 3 small whaleboats. 3 months later, a handful of emaciated survivors were picked up at sea. 12 men died, and some of the dead were eaten by the starving crew. The event later gave Herman Melville the climactic scene of Moby Dick. Handle the details of that account with care. Chase estimated the whale at 85 feet and around 80 tons, which exceeds what we understand the species to reach. The largest reliably documented sperm whales fall well short of that. He was a traumatized man writing about an animal that had just destroyed his ship and stranded him in the open Pacific, and every number in his account should be read in that light. Also, his description of the whale as enraged and vengeful is interpretation, not observation. We do not know what the animal intended. What is not in question is the physical outcome. A sperm whale hit a wooden ship hard enough twice to sink it. That is a real event with survivors and documentation, and it is not the only account of a whale striking a vessel. So the question became mechanical rather than literary. Can that structure actually do that without destroying the animal? The skull of a sperm whale, viewed from the front, is not a smooth dome. It is a deep, concave basin, a bowl of bone, and the oil-filled complex sits in it. The junk, the lower of the 2 compartments, is a stack of dense fatty lens bodies separated by sheets of connective tissue running through it like bulkheads. In 2016, a research team ran finite element analysis on that architecture, the same class of engineering simulation used to test whether a bridge or a tunnel will hold under load, combined with probabilistic simulation to account for how uncertain some of the tissue properties are. What they found was that the connective tissue partitions in the junk substantially reduced the stresses transmitted to the skull under impact. In effect, the structure behaves like a very large shock absorber, and the results were reported as consistent with the hypothesis that the junk evolved in part to function as a battering ram in male-to-male combat. Keep the word hypothesis where it belongs. That study is a model, not a filmed event. Nobody has recorded 2 bull sperm whales ramming each other. A finite element simulation tells you a structure could withstand and transmit certain forces. It does not tell you the animal uses it that way. Other researchers have pushed back on how much the modeling can establish, and the discussion is live. The strongest honest statement is this: the anatomy is compatible with ramming. The historical record contains ships that were rammed, and the function is argued rather than settled. What makes the argument compelling rather than fanciful is that it fits everything else about male sperm whales. Bulls are enormous relative to females, which across mammals usually signals competition between males. Bulls carry heavy scarring on the head and jaws, some of it consistent with the teeth of other sperm whales. Bulls have the largest and most exaggerated forehead complex, and it grows disproportionately as they mature. Whalers reported bulls with broken and healed jaws. Put those together, and the picture is of an animal that fights other members of its own species hard, using its face. Now notice the strangeness of it. The structure that focuses the loudest click any animal produces may be the same structure that gets driven into another animal at speed. An instrument and a ram in one block of tissue, occupying a quarter of the body. Which of those came first is not resolved. There is a long-standing argument raised by researchers working on the anatomy that sexual selection has shaped the sperm whale's nose on a scale that goes well beyond what echolocation alone would require. That the sheer size of a bull's forehead is partly an advertisement and partly a weapon, layered on top of a sensory organ. That remains a hypothesis. Sound production is the function the anatomy and the recordings support most directly. Everything else is inference on top of it. For the comparison with orcas, though, the practical consequence is what matters, and the practical consequence is straightforward. A lone bull sperm whale is not undefended. He is a 16-meter animal with a reinforced impact structure occupying the front third of his body, a jaw lined with conical teeth that can be 20 centimeters long, and a tail that can move a 40-ton mass. A killer whale that commits to that is gambling its life on a single exchange in open water, with no ice to work with, no beach, no shallow bottom, and nothing to isolate. And here is the detail that should have ended the ranking debate on its own. Orcas can only fight a sperm whale at all if the sperm whale is at the surface. The moment it goes down, the fight is over, because they cannot follow. A sperm whale that dives to 1,000 meters has not escaped by being fast. It has left the map. There is no pursuit possible. The orca's entire toolkit, speed, coordination, breath, sensory range, the whole magnificent apparatus, expires somewhere around a few hundred meters, and below that line, the sperm whale is simply gone. That is why the rosette happens at the surface, and only at the surface. It is not the sperm whale's preferred move. It is what a deep animal has to do during the few minutes a day it is trapped in the shallow world where its enemy lives. Which reframes the whole encounter? We have been picturing this as two predators meeting. It is closer to a submarine surfacing briefly into contested airspace, holding formation while it recharges, and then submerging back into a place the enemy cannot go. So what is running all of this? Because none of what we have covered is reflex. Holding a formation under sustained attack requires the group to act as a group. Leaving that formation to retrieve a wounded member requires something like a decision. Hunting by echo in absolute darkness requires interpreting a stream of returning sound and building a working model of a space you cannot see. Managing an oxygen budget across a 45-minute dive requires something monitoring the cost. All of it points at one organ. And it is the organ everyone assumes they already know the answer about. The largest brain on the planet does not belong to a killer whale, or to us, or to any animal that has ever walked on land. Average adult brain masses for large male sperm whales come in around 7.9 kilograms. Killer whale brains are also enormous, among the largest of any animal, and typically run in the range of 5 to 6 kilograms, with larger individuals recorded. Sperm whales and killer whales sit at the top of the brain size list for all living animals, and the sperm whale sits above. But there is a wrinkle here that gets left out of every triumphant version of this fact, and leaving it out would be dishonest. The single heaviest brain ever weighed is reported not from a sperm whale, but from a killer whale at around 9.3 kilograms, with a sperm whale specimen close behind at about 9.2. Individual records overlap. The species level average favors the sperm whale. The record for one exceptional animal does not. That is the accurate picture, and it is more interesting than the clean version because it points at something the raw numbers miss entirely. Brain mass is a bad proxy for intelligence and always has been. Bigger animals need more neural tissue to run bigger bodies. A sperm whale is enormous, so some of that mass is simply the overhead of operating 40 tons of animal. Comparing brains by weight and stopping there tells you almost nothing. Look inside, though, and the two species diverge in a way that is genuinely revealing. The proportions differ sharply. In sperm whales, the cerebellum makes up roughly 7% of total brain mass. In killer whales, it is close to 14%, around double the share. The cerebellum is heavily involved in motor coordination, in timing, in fine control of movement, and in aspects of sensory processing tied to acting in space. Researchers looking at that difference have suggested it maps onto how the two animals live. The killer whale is a fast, acrobatic, visually driven hunter that produces a wide range of sounds, tackles many different prey types, and executes precise, high-speed, coordinated maneuvers in a lit environment. That lifestyle demands exactly the sort of processing a large cerebellum supports. The sperm whale is not doing that. It is doing something slower, longer, and stranger in the dark, and its brain is proportioned differently as a result. There is also work suggesting that the neural architecture of the deep-diving whales may relate to how long they can stay down. That differences in neuron density and in brain structure between dolphins and deep divers may be connected to the oxygen demands of neural tissue and therefore to dive duration. Treat that as an active area of research rather than a settled conclusion. The brain is expensive to run, oxygen is the limiting currency of a deep dive, and how those two facts interact is exactly the kind of question that is still open. So the honest scoreboard on intelligence is not a knockout. It is a split decision, and the split is more interesting than a winner. Where the sperm whale does pull clearly ahead is not in the organ. It is in the network the organ is plugged into. Orca society is famously tight. Resident pods are matrilineal, stable, and long-lived. Females go through menopause and then live for decades afterward, which is extraordinarily rare among mammals, humans, killer whales, and a small handful of other toothed whales. Post-reproductive grandmothers appear to improve the survival of their grandchildren, particularly in lean years, which is generally read as evidence that the old females carry knowledge the group depends on, where the fish are in a bad season. Which route to take? That is culture doing real work, and it is one of the best documented cases of it in any animal. The scale, though, is a pod. Tens of animals. Sometimes a community of a few pods sharing a dialect. Sperm whale society is built on a different order of magnitude, and the structure has layers. At the base is the social unit, a stable, long-lasting group of females and immature animals, often related, that stays together for years, and in many cases for life. Males leave, females largely do not. Above that sits something with no clean equivalent in the orca world. Social units associate with other units that share a particular repertoire of click patterns, codas, which are short, structured sequences of clicks, distinct from the loud echolocation pulses used for hunting. Units that share a coda repertoire belong to the same vocal clan, and clans are enormous. They are marked on ocean basin scales. Units belonging to the same clan can be separated by thousands of kilometers of open water and still recognize each other by dialect. And then comes the part that is genuinely difficult to absorb. Whales from different clans, sharing the same stretch of ocean at the same time, largely do not associate. They swim through the same water and stay socially separate. Research on clans in the Atlantic has described exactly this. Socially segregated groups occupying overlapping ranges, sorted not by geography or genetics, but by dialect. That is a division that is not physical. It is not a mountain range, or a current, or a temperature boundary. It is a difference in the pattern of clicks a group uses, and it partitions an ocean. Work on coda structure has found identity information layered at multiple levels within the calls. Cues to the individual, to the social unit, and to the clan, encoded in the same short bursts of sound. More recent analysis has looked at combinatorial and contextual structure in sperm whale vocalizations, examining how elements combine in ways that carry more information than a fixed set of calls would. That research is ongoing, and it needs to be described as ongoing. Nobody has decoded sperm whale communication. Claims that we have translated it are not supported. What the work shows is structure, and structure is where you look when you want to know whether a signal is carrying more than mood. Now connect that network back to the dive. Train Morsino and train and bow. Because the society is not a decoration on top of the biology. It is a direct consequence of it. A sperm whale mother has to feed at 800 meters. Her calf physiologically cannot follow. The diving adaptations that let an adult go down take time to develop, and a young calf cannot hold its breath for 45 minutes, cannot handle the pressure, and cannot make the climb. So every time she eats, she leaves her calf at the surface, alone. For most of an hour, in open ocean. That is an unsolvable problem for a solitary animal, and it is worth stating plainly. The mother must either starve or abandon the calf to whatever is up there. There is no third option available to an individual. There is a third option available to a group. Researchers have documented babysitting in sperm whales, the calf staying at the surface in the company of other adults while its mother is down, along with dive synchrony among group members and indications of alloparental care, meaning care directed at young that are not the animal's own. There is documented variation between groups in how much of this caregiving happens, which is itself an interesting thread, and there are observations of collaborative behavior around birth. Follow the causal chain because it is clean. Prey is a kilometer down. The mother must go there. The calf cannot. Therefore, the calf must be covered by someone else. Therefore, the group must be stable, long-term, and cooperative, or calves die. Therefore, individuals must be able to identify each other and their group reliably, across separations of an hour, and depths of a kilometer, and distances of many kilometers of open water. Therefore, identity must be encoded in sound, because sound is the only thing that travels in that environment. Therefore, dialects. The deep dive built the society. The society made the deep dive survivable. Neither works without the other. And that is where the sperm whale's network stops being a curiosity and becomes the thing that saved the species, because it was tested, at scale, against the most efficient predator that has ever operated in the ocean. Not orcas, us. For most of the 19th century, sperm whales were hunted by open-boat whalers. The method was appalling and simple. A sailing ship spots a pod, lowers small wooden boats rowed by men. They come alongside a whale, and a harpooner throws by hand. The whale is then killed at close range with lances. The prize was the oil, and above all the spermaceti from the head, which burned cleaner and brighter than anything else available and lubricated the machines of the Industrial Revolution. This industry killed sperm whales in enormous numbers across every ocean. Here is the part of that history that nobody expects. An analysis published in 2021 examined digitized logbooks from American whalers operating in the North Pacific. The actual working records of the ships, including sightings and strikes. The researchers looked at how the rate of successfully harpooning a sighted whale changed over time as whaling expanded into a region. It fell by about 58% over the first few years of exploitation in a region, not over a century, over the first few years. Think about what could produce that. The obvious explanations get tested and struggle. Maybe the first whalers were simply better. The elite crews who got there first and later arrivals were less skilled. The data argue against it. The strike rates of those same early whalers in other oceans, where whaling had a longer history, were not elevated. They were not superhuman. They were normal crews. Maybe the first whales killed were the naive, vulnerable, easy individuals. And what remained was a tougher population. That kind of selective removal cannot produce a collapse that fast. The arithmetic does not work. Maybe it was evolution. It absolutely was not. A few years is a handful of years in the life of an animal that can live many decades and reproduces slowly. Genetic change does not move at that speed, not remotely, which leaves behavior. And behavior that spreads faster than reproduction has only one route: learning. The whalers' own journals describe the change. Whales that had previously clustered at the surface, which is to say whales that responded to a threat the way they had always responded, by forming up, began doing something else. They dove when ships came into sight. They fled. And specifically, they fled upwind, which for a sailing vessel is the single most difficult direction to follow. Some attack the boats. Look at what fleeing upwind actually requires. A wooden sailing ship cannot sail directly into the wind. It has to tack, zigzagging back and forth, covering far more distance than the whale does and taking far longer. A whale that runs upwind is not merely running away. It is exploiting a specific, non-obvious limitation of the machine hunting it. A limitation that has nothing to do with any predator that species had encountered in its entire evolutionary history. The researchers modeled social learning as the mechanism. Naive social units, encountering whalers for the first time, learning defensive measures from experienced units they were grouped with. Their models could produce the documented collapse in strike rate. Say it as the authors would. This is a model that is consistent with the data, and other explanations were tested and found wanting. It is not a filmed transmission of information from one whale to another. It is a strong inference from the best records available. Now put it next to what we already know about the rosette, and the shape of the whole thing becomes almost painful. The defense sperm whales evolved works beautifully against toothed predators. Close ranks. Present flukes outward. Protect the center. Do not separate. Against orcas, it imposes a cost high enough that predation is rare. Against men in wooden boats with hand-thrown harpoons, that same behavior is a catastrophe. A cluster of stationary whales at the surface, holding position, not fleeing, is not a fortress. It is a lineup. The whalers could simply row up and take them one after another. The instinct that had protected the species for millions of years delivered it to us. And within a few years, in a region, they stopped doing it. There is no genetic mechanism that does that. The information had to move through the population the way information moves through a population that has language-like signals, stable social units, and a network of clans spanning an ocean basin. The same architecture that lets a mother find her calf after an hour at 800 meters is the architecture that moved a survival update across the North Pacific, faster than any process of selection could have. Hold that against the standard story about which of these two animals is the clever one. Orca intelligence is real, extensively documented, and impressive. It is also famous largely because it is performed in front of us, at the surface, in daylight, near shore, in aquariums, on camera. Every measure we apply is a measure we can see. The sperm whale's cognitive achievement was not performed for us. It was performed against us, in open ocean, in the middle of an extermination campaign, and the only reason we know about it is that our own hunters wrote down how often they missed. There is a loose end from earlier that needs settling before any of this can be called a fair comparison, because I left it deliberately unresolved, and it is the strongest card the other side has. Orcas can dive deep. Deeper than most people think, and deeper than the routine numbers suggest. The recorded maxima keep climbing as more animals get tagged, and the figures quoted earlier were the floor of that trend, rather than the ceiling. The standout is an adult female tracked to 1,087 meters, well past anything previously recorded for the species. 1,000 meters. That is squarely inside sperm whale foraging territory. So the wall is not absolute, and anyone claiming orcas physically cannot go deep is overstating it. What the record actually demonstrates is more interesting than a simple limit, and it cuts in an unexpected direction. It demonstrates that the depth gap is not primarily about capability. It is about economics. An orca that reaches 1,000 meters has done something extraordinary once. A sperm whale that reaches 1,000 meters has gone to work. The record dive is a single data point pulled from a tag record, otherwise full of dives, around 4 minutes and a few tens of meters. It is the ceiling, touched once, in an animal whose floor is the entire rest of its life. And there are hard physical reasons that ceiling cannot become a lifestyle. Start with the oxygen. Every diving mammal carries a store, and the size of that store relative to how fast the animal burns it sets the dive time. Deep diving whales load their muscles with myoglobin at concentrations that turn the tissue nearly black. Dolphins and killer whales carry less store, and a body running hotter and faster means a shorter clock. Then there is what the animal does with the time. An orca is built for acceleration. Speed is expensive. Every burst costs oxygen at a rate a slow-swimming whale never approaches. And that is fine when the surface is 30 seconds away and lethal when it is 15 minutes away. Then there is the return trip. A sperm whale climbing from 1,000 meters is a specialist doing something it has done tens of thousands of times, gliding portions of the ascent, managing its budget. An orca making the same climb is spending a reserve it does not have much of on a journey that is not going to pay for itself. And that last phrase is the real answer, because the deepest problem is not the dive. It is the meal. What is an orca supposed to eat down there? Its prey lives in the light. Salmon, herring, seals, sea lions, sharks, dolphins, whale calves. Every one of them is a surface or shallow animal. There is no seal at 900 meters. Even if a killer whale reached the deep and had the breath to hunt in it, the things it knows how to catch, has the equipment to catch, and has been culturally taught to recognize as food are all somewhere else. So the deep dive earns nothing. It costs an enormous share of the day's oxygen budget and returns no calories, and an animal that does that repeatedly starves. The wall is not made of pressure. It is made of return on investment, and that is a much harder wall to climb than a physiological one, because physiology can be pushed and arithmetic cannot. That raises the obvious follow-up, and it exposes an assumption almost everybody carries without examining it. If there is nothing down there for a killer whale to eat, what exactly is the sperm whale eating? What is actually alive at 1,000 meters in the middle of an ocean basin? The intuition says almost nothing. Dark, cold, no plants, no light, no photosynthesis, thousands of kilometers from anywhere. A void. The intuition is spectacularly wrong, and correcting it is the moment the deep ocean stops being a setting and becomes a system. Between roughly 200 and 1,000 meters sits a layer that ships have been detecting by accident for the better part of a century. When early echo sounders were pointed downward in open ocean, They return to false bottom, a reflective surface hundreds of meters down, in water that charts said was kilometers deep. Operators thought their equipment was faulty. The equipment was fine. The false bottom was alive. It is a layer of animals dense enough to bounce sound. Small fish, squid, crustaceans, gelatinous animals, packed through the midwater in numbers that reflected sonar like a seafloor. Oceanographers call it the deep scattering layer, and it moves. Every night as the light fades, that entire layer rises. Hundreds of meters of vertical travel undertaken by an almost unimaginable number of animals, up toward the surface to feed under cover of darkness. Every morning, as light returns, it sinks back down into the dark, where predators that hunt by sight cannot follow. Up at dusk, down at dawn. Every day. Across every ocean on the planet. It is the largest migration on Earth, and it happens twice a day. And almost nobody has ever seen it. Estimating how much biomass is involved is genuinely difficult, and the figures have been revised substantially as the acoustic and netting methods improved. Earlier estimates of mesopelagic fish biomass were later argued to be far too low, with some analyses proposing an order of magnitude more. That range remains actively debated, and the honest position is that we know the layer is vast, and do not yet know how vast. What matters for this story is the shape of it. There is an immense, mobile, self-renewing band of prey sitting in the midwater of every ocean, cycling up and down on a daily rhythm, driven by light. And essentially, nothing that hunts at the surface can reach it during the day. That layer, and the deeper water below it, is what the sperm whale is farming. It is why the animal is where it is, and it is why the loudest sound in nature exists. The prey is not gathered in one place. It is smeared through an enormous volume of black water, moving, and nothing finds it except by flooding that volume with sound and listening for what comes back. The hunt itself is where this gets strange, because the tag records let us listen to it happening. When a sperm whale descends, it starts clicking. Regular, evenly spaced, powerful clicks, pushed out ahead of it as it goes down, each one reaching far into the dark and returning a picture of what is there. Those are search clicks. They are the animal sweeping a beam through the water column, looking for something worth turning toward. Then, when it finds something, the rhythm changes. The clicks come faster and faster. The interval between them collapses until the individual pulses run together into a rapid burst that researchers describe as a creak or a buzz. Every click is a fresh update on where the target is, so as the whale closes the distance, it needs the updates faster. The way you would take a longer look at something far away, and then rapid glances at something about to hit you. That buzz is the sound of a sperm whale, closing on prey in total darkness, and the tag records are full of them. Dozens per dive, which tells you something the stomach contents alone could not. This animal is not making one dramatic kill per trip. It is making repeated captures over and over throughout the dive, working the layer methodically. Dive, descend, sweep, detect, close, take, sweep, again. The image of the epic duel dies here for good. What the acoustics describe is closer to a harvester running a field. And then there is the way it actually takes the prey, which contains one of the best small mysteries in the whole animal. Look at the mouth. The lower jaw of a sperm whale is a long, narrow rod slung under that enormous head, carrying a row of heavy conical teeth. The upper jaw has sockets for them, but the upper teeth typically do not erupt in any useful way. The teeth in the lower jaw often do not erupt until the animal is well grown. So you have a predator that spends its early years feeding successfully, at depth, with a mouth that is barely equipped. It gets stranger. Whaling-era records include sperm whales with lower jaws that were badly broken, deformed, twisted, or effectively useless, animals that could not have gripped prey in any conventional way, found in apparently reasonable nutritional condition. That is a serious problem for the idea that the teeth are the feeding apparatus, and it is the main evidence behind a long-running proposal that sperm whales feed substantially by suction, opening the mouth and drawing prey in with a rapid pull of water rather than seizing it. Keep that where it belongs. It is an inference from indirect evidence. Jaw morphology, the tooth eruption pattern, the condition of injured animals, and not a filmed observation of the mechanism. Suction feeding of some kind is widely considered plausible and is not universally accepted as the whole story. If that is what is happening, though, it reorganizes the animal one more time, because it would mean the teeth are not the weapon, the jaw is not the weapon, and the front third of the body is doing all the work. The head finds the prey with sound, the mouth vacuums it. The famous teeth may be for something else entirely, and the most commonly proposed something else is other sperm whales. Now add the environment those captures happen in. At 1,000 meters, the water sits at a few degrees above freezing everywhere on Earth, tropics included. The warm surface layer is a thin lid over an ocean that is uniformly, permanently cold. A 40-ton animal has an advantage there. Large bodies lose heat slowly relative to their volume, but it is still spending an hour repeatedly in water that would kill an unprotected human in minutes, under pressure that would collapse an unreinforced steel cylinder in complete darkness, working. And the reason sound is the answer to all of it, the reason the animal built a face instead of a pair of eyes, comes down to a comparison between two kinds of wave that most people have never had a reason to make. Light does badly in seawater, not just in the deep, everywhere. Water absorbs and scatters it aggressively, and it does so unevenly by wavelength. Red goes first, within the first several meters. Orange and yellow follow. Blue penetrates furthest, which is why the sea looks blue, and why underwater footage without artificial lighting comes back in a monochrome wash. Even in the clearest tropical water, the useful light is gone within a couple of 100 meters. Light is a short-range sense in the ocean, and it always has been. Sound is the opposite, and the difference is not marginal. Sound travels through seawater at roughly 1.5 kilometers per second, around 4.5 times faster than in air, and it holds together over distances that light cannot approach. Low frequencies in particular can cross entire ocean basins. There is a physical reason for that, and it is one of the strangest features of the ocean. The speed of sound in water is set by temperature, pressure, and salinity. Near the surface, the water is warm, and sound moves fast. Descend, and the temperature drops, and the speed of sound drops with it. Keep descending, and the temperature stops falling. The deep ocean is uniformly cold, while pressure keeps rising, and pressure pushes the speed of sound back up. So there is a depth where the speed of sound reaches its minimum. Above it, sound moves faster. Below it, sound moves faster. And a sound wave that starts to leave that layer in either direction gets bent back into it by refraction, the same way light bends in a lens. The result is a horizontal corridor running through the ocean in which sound is trapped and cannot easily escape. It is called the Deep Sound Channel, or the SOFAR channel, and in mid-latitudes it typically sits somewhere between 600 and 1,200 meters. Sound injected into it loses energy very slowly and can propagate for thousands of kilometers. Navies exploited it. Downed pilots in the Second World War could sink a small charge into the layer and let listening stations thousands of kilometers away triangulate the detonation. Now look at the depth range where that corridor sits and compare it to where sperm whales forage. They are the same water. Be careful with what that does and does not mean, because it is easy to overreach here. The deep sound channel favors low frequencies. Sperm whale echolocation clicks are high frequency, broadband pulses, and high frequencies attenuate much faster and do not ride the channel the way a fin whale's low moan does. Nobody should tell you sperm whale clicks circle the globe. They do not. What is true is that the ocean below the surface layer is an acoustic environment in a way the surface never is. That sound is the only signal with real range down there, and that an animal committing its entire sensory life to sound is not making a quirky choice. It is making the only choice available. In a place where light dies in meters and sound crosses kilometers, the animal that invests everything into sound wins, and the animal that invests in eyes is limited to the thin lit band at the top. That is the physical rule underneath this entire comparison, stated plainly. The orca is an eye-driven predator with sonar support, and eyes have a range of meters. The sperm whale is a sound-driven predator that also happens to have eyes, and sound has a range of kilometers. One of those is a design for the surface. The other is a design for the ocean. There is a question most versions of this story never get to, and it is the one that gives the whole thing a spine running back through deep time. Was the sperm whale always like this? The fossil record says no, and what it says instead is genuinely unsettling. In 2010, a team working in the Pisco Formation of Peru described a skull, jaw, and teeth from the Miocene, roughly 12 to 13 million years old. The animal was named Leviathan melvillei. It belongs to the same broad group as the modern sperm whale, the physeteroids, and it is nothing like the animal swimming today. The skull is about 3 meters long. The rostrum is broad and heavy. The temporal fossae, the openings in the skull that house the jaw muscles, are enormous, which is the anatomical signature of a very powerful bite. And the teeth are the part that stops you, not conical pegs, confined to a narrow lower jaw. Large functional teeth in both jaws, with crown heights reported up to around 36 centimeters and diameters around 12. Reconstructed total length estimates commonly land somewhere between about 13 and 17.5 meters, though the remains are incomplete, and that range should be treated as an estimate rather than a measurement. Sit with what that describes: a physeteroid the size of a modern sperm whale, with a reinforced skull, massive jaw musculature, and teeth in both jaws long enough to reach from your elbow to your fingertips. That is not a squid hunter. That is a macro predator built to seize, hold, and dismember large prey, and it lived in seas that also contained large baleen whales and enormous sharks. The sperm whale lineage, in other words, once produced exactly the animal the ranking assumes, should win: the surface monster. The apex predator that takes big, warm-bodied prey with a catastrophic bite. It existed, and it was gigantic, and it is gone. Why it disappeared is not settled. The usual candidates get discussed: long-term ocean cooling reshaping ecosystems, changes in the availability of the large prey such an animal would have needed, shifts in competition, and the fossil record for marine mammals is patchy enough that confident narratives about extinction causes should be treated with suspicion. The remains we have are a skull and teeth. That is a shape, and shapes tell you a great deal about what a body could do, and very little about the day it stopped working. And be careful about the family tree. The modern sperm whale is not the descendant of Leviathan. They are branches, not a line. The lineage produced both. What the fossil does establish is that this group of animals was not funneled into the deep by lack of options. There was a version that stayed up in the light and hunted large prey with its teeth, and that version is a fossil in Peru. The version that is still here, nearly 360,000 animals across every ocean, on the best estimate we have, is the one that took its whole body, converted its face into an acoustic instrument, filled its muscles with oxygen until they turned black and left the surface behind to eat something almost nothing else could reach. The strategy that looks like retreat outlasted the strategy that looks like dominance, which is not a moral and it is not a rule. Plenty of surface predators have thrived for tens of millions of years. It is a single data point from one family, and one data point does not make a law. What it does is put the modern comparison in a longer frame. When we look at an orca and a sperm whale, we are not looking at a champion and an underdog. We are looking at two solutions to the same ocean, one of which is optimized for the part with light in it, and one of which walked away from that competition entirely and went to work in the largest habitat on the planet. And walking away had a price, which is written into how slowly this animal makes more of itself. Sperm whales are extraordinarily slow reproducers. Gestation runs well over a year. A calf nurses for a long time, in some cases for years, and calving intervals stretch across multiple years rather than annually. Females mature at a leisurely pace. Males take it further and keep growing for decades, which is why a fully mature bull is such an outlier in size, and why bulls of that size were the first thing whaling removed. That life history is a direct consequence of everything else. A calf that cannot dive has to be covered by the group. Milk has to be produced by a mother who is spending most of her day a kilometer underwater. There is no way to make that fast. And it means that when a population is knocked down, it does not spring back. Industrial whaling in the 20th century took sperm whales at a scale the open boat era never reached, and the recovery, whatever its actual pace, is measured in generations of an animal that can live longer than most of the people reading about it. The day is full. The dive is long. The calf is slow. There is no spare capacity anywhere in the design, none of which comes free. And this is the point where admiration should start to feel uncomfortable, because the price of living that way is written into how the animal spends its hours. Ask a simple question about a 40-ton predator that dives a kilometer down dozens of times a day. When does it sleep? For a long time, the honest answer was that nobody knew. You cannot watch an animal sleep at 800 meters, and the surface intervals were so short and so busy with breathing that they did not look like rest. Then tags went on, and what came back was one of the strangest images in the animal world. A 2008 study using tags attached by suction cup recorded the behavior of 59 sperm whales at locations around the world. 31 of them performed something the researchers called drift dives. The whale stops swimming. It pitches upward until it is oriented vertically in the water, and it hangs there, motionless and silent, nose toward the surface, drifting, not swimming, not clicking, not doing anything. The recorded durations of these inactive periods range from under a minute to about half an hour, averaging roughly 13 minutes, and across the tag records, drift dive bouts accounted for around 7% of the time. 7%. The researchers noted that this would be less sleep than any other mammal that has been studied. There is a caveat that belongs right next to that number. Tags do not measure sleep directly. They measure posture, movement, and sound. A motionless, silent, vertically drifting whale is a very good candidate for a sleeping whale, and the study is the foundation of what we think we know. But this is inference from behavior rather than a direct recording of a sleeping brain. Treat 7% as the best available figure rather than a settled biological constant. Even with the caveat, picture what the tags describe. A pod of sperm whales suspended vertically in blue water, nose up, unmoving, spaced out like standing stones, asleep in the middle of the ocean. The image is famous now. What gets missed is that it is not whimsy. It is a symptom. Work backward through the constraint. Prey is a kilometer down. Getting there and back costs most of an hour, without a breath. The surface interval needed to reload oxygen and clear the metabolic debt is around 9 minutes. An animal of that size, running that engine, needs an enormous amount of food, which means it needs a large number of dives, which means the day fills up with dive surface, and there is almost no slack in the schedule. Sleep has to fit into the gaps. And there are barely any gaps. So the sperm whale sleeps the way a person sleeps standing up on a train between shifts, in short bouts, vertically, wherever the schedule allows. Set that beside an orca's day, and the contrast is not subtle. Killer whales rest in coordinated groups near the surface, moving slowly, breathing regularly, in water where the food they need is within a couple of minutes of the air they need. They have time. Their prey is in the same layer as their oxygen. There is no 45-minute commute between the two. The orca's life, judged purely on physical demand, is the comfortable one. Faster, more dramatic, more violent in the moment, and vastly less punishing hour by hour. And that leads straight to the question that reverses everything one more time. If the orca has the easier life, the more flexible menu on paper, the greater speed, the more advanced coordination, and the more forgiving depth range, then why is it the orca that is in trouble? Give the orca its due first, properly, because the answer only makes sense once you see how much they have going for them. Killer whales are among the very few mammals on Earth where females go through menopause and then keep living for decades. Humans do it. Killer whales do it. A small number of other toothed whales do it. Almost nothing else does, and from an evolutionary standpoint, an animal that stops reproducing while remaining healthy is a puzzle, because natural selection has no obvious reason to maintain a body that is no longer making copies of itself. The explanation that has the most support is that those old females are worth more to the group alive than they would be reproducing. Research on resident killer whales has found that the presence of post-reproductive females is associated with improved survival of their grandchildren, and that the effect is strongest in lean years when prey is scarce. Think about what that implies. In a good year, the grandmother matters less. In a bad year, she matters enormously, which means what she is providing is not food and not muscle. It is information. Where the fish are when the usual places fail, which route to take, which show yet what to do when the ordinary pattern breaks down. The knowledge lives in the oldest animals, and the group survives crises by consulting them. And it goes further than passive knowledge. Off Peninsula Valdez, where orcas launch themselves onto gravel beaches to take sea lion pups, researchers have described adults working with juveniles in ways widely interpreted as teaching. The young animals practicing the maneuver, adults involved in the process, the technique passing down rather than being reinvented. Intentional stranding is a genuinely dangerous move. An orca that misjudges it can be left on the beach. That a population performs it at all, and that only some populations do, points squarely at transmitted skill rather than instinct. Nothing about that is a lesser achievement than anything the sperm whale does. It is culture, doing exactly what culture is supposed to do, storing hard-won solutions outside the genome and handing them to the next generation faster than evolution could. And it is precisely why the situation is dangerous, because knowledge stored in individuals can be lost when individuals die. A population of a few dozen animals holds its accumulated expertise in a handful of aging females. Lose them in a bad decade, and the information does not exist anywhere else. There is no backup. A genome can survive a bottleneck. A technique refined over generations cannot necessarily survive the death of the animals who knew it. Layer onto that a diet locked onto a declining fish, a range that sits against the most heavily developed coastlines on the planet, vessel traffic that interferes with the echolocation those populations use to find individual salmon, and a population size small enough that researchers know every animal by name and by the shape of its dorsal fin. Then add the thing that is invisible, that nobody sees on a whale watching trip. And that is the reason the modeling gets frightening. Because being at the top of a food chain is not a position of safety. It is a position of concentration. Here is the mechanism. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it in any ecosystem. Certain industrial chemicals do not break down easily and do not dissolve in water. They dissolve in fat. Polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, are the classic example. They were manufactured in enormous quantities through much of the 20th century for electrical equipment, coolants, and countless industrial uses, and they were banned in many countries decades ago. Banned is not the same as gone. They persist in sediments, in soil, in landfills, and they keep leaking into the sea. Once they enter the food web, they climb. A small amount gets into plankton. A fish eats a great deal of plankton over its life and keeps most of the contaminant load because the chemical does not break down and does not flush out. A larger fish eats many of those fish. A seal eats many of those larger fish. And a killer whale eats many of those seals. At every step, the biomass shrinks and the contaminant does not. That is biomagnification, and it means the concentration multiplies at each level. Draw it as a pyramid, enormous base, tiny apex, and the same total quantity of poison squeezed upward until it is packed into the smallest compartment at the top. The animal at the top of the tallest food chain in the ocean receives the most concentrated dose of everything the ocean has absorbed. That is the killer whale, especially the mammal-eating populations, which feed at the highest trophic levels, and especially those living near industrialized coastlines. The consequences run through fat, and fat is where the second half of the trap closes. PCBs are stored in blubber, which is relatively safe as long as the blubber stays put. When an animal fasts, or falls sick, or runs short of prey, it metabolizes that blubber, and the stored contaminant is released into the bloodstream in a pulse. So the animal is most heavily exposed exactly when it is already in trouble. Then there is lactation. Whale milk is extraordinarily rich in fat, and a mother mobilizing her fat reserves to make it transfers her contaminant burden directly to her calf. A firstborn calf takes the largest share because it receives the accumulated load of the mother's entire life up to that point. That arithmetic is grim. Reproduction becomes a route of detoxification for the mother and a route of poisoning for the calf. The effects flagged in the research are on reproduction and on immune function, fewer surviving calves, and animals less able to fight off disease. In 2018, a study in Science modeled this globally. Using an individual-based model and available data on PCB concentrations in killer whale tissues from around the world, the authors projected the effects forward and concluded that PCB-mediated impacts on reproduction and immune function threaten the long-term viability of more than half of the world's killer whale populations. Populations near industrialized regions and populations feeding at high trophic levels regardless of where they live were identified as being at high risk of collapse. The lead author described the models as predicting high collapse risk in some areas within a span of a few decades. Now handle that honestly, because it was not received as settled truth. The paper drew a published rebuttal arguing against the projection of a global collapse, and the debate over how much confidence those model outputs deserve is real and ongoing. Models are built on assumptions. The input data vary in quality between populations, and projecting a century forward compounds every uncertainty in the chain. The disagreement is about the severity and the timeline. The underlying mechanism is not in dispute. PCBs biomagnify, killer whales carry some of the highest burdens measured in any animal, and those burdens are associated with reproductive and immune harm. And this is where the two species split again, for a reason that follows directly from everything already covered. The sperm whale does not feed at the same level. Deepwater squids sit lower in the food chain than seals and sharks and dolphins do. Fewer steps of magnification stand between the plankton and the whale. It is not clean. Nothing in the ocean is clean anymore, and sperm whales carry contaminant burdens too. But the position is structurally less exposed. The geography compounds it in the same direction. Contaminants concentrate near the industrialized coasts where they were made and dumped. An animal whose entire life happens in coastal water off a heavily populated region sits inside the source. An animal that spends its life over deep ocean basins, thousands of kilometers of open water in every direction, is diluted into a far larger system. The orca is a coastal specialist in a world where humans live on coasts. And then, the last multiplier, which is population structure. And it is arguably the worst of them, because orcas are divided into ecotypes that do not interbreed and populations that do not mix. Any given orca population is small, sometimes very small, sometimes a few dozen animals individually named and photographed, with every birth and death recorded. Small populations are fragile in ways large ones are not, and the reasons stack. Genetic diversity is limited. A single bad year for prey hits everyone at once because everyone eats the same thing in the same place. Losing a few breeding females is not a statistic, it is a measurable fraction of the future. And in an animal where hunting knowledge is cultural, losing older individuals means losing information that is not written anywhere else, where prey concentrates in a bad season, how to execute a technique that took generations to refine. An orca population can lose its culture before it loses its last animal, and a population that has lost the knowledge of how to hunt is functionally finished even while it is still swimming. Set that against 360,000 or so sperm whales, a number with wide error bars, but an order of magnitude that is not seriously in question, distributed across the deep water of every ocean on the planet, feeding on a prey base that is nowhere near collapse. In a habitat no fishery has yet exploited at scale, and no coastal development can drain, none of which makes them invulnerable. Ship strikes kill them. Entanglement kills them. They carry chemical burdens because everything in the ocean does now. And the water gets louder every year with shipping traffic, which for an animal that navigates, hunts, and holds its entire society together through sound is not background irritation. It is interference with the sense it lives by. What the numbers buy is not safety. It is robustness of a specific structural kind. Many animals, spread across an enormous area, eating something abundant with no single point of failure anywhere in the system. And there is one more measurement nobody thought to take, because it is not a measurement of strength at all. Ask which of these two animals the ocean itself would miss. That question has an answer, and it is not the one the ranking predicts. Start from a fact about the ocean that sounds like it belongs in a different documentary. The surface of the open ocean is, over vast areas, close to a desert. That statement confuses people because the surface is where the light is, and light is where growth should happen. Every food web in the sea is ultimately built on phytoplankton, microscopic algae that photosynthesize in the sunlit layer and feed everything above them. The light is right there, so why would the surface be poor? Because photosynthesis needs more than light. It needs nutrients, and in large regions of the world's ocean, one nutrient in particular is the bottleneck: iron. Phytoplankton require iron in trace amounts to function, and across huge stretches of open ocean, the Southern Ocean around Antarctica being the classic case, iron is so scarce that it caps how much life the surface can support. There is light. There are the other nutrients. There is not enough iron, and so the growth stalls. Oceanographers describe these regions with a specific phrase: high nutrient, low chlorophyll. Plenty of the raw materials, not enough of the trigger, and therefore not enough green. Iron sinks. That is the problem. It arrives from dust blown off continents and from upwelling. And once it is in a particle that drops out of the sunlit layer, It has gone downward, into the dark, where nothing can photosynthesize with it. The deep ocean has iron. The surface needs it. Gravity runs the wrong way, so something has to carry it back up. Now think about what a sperm whale physically does, described purely as a transport process, with all the drama stripped out. It descends to 800 or 1,000 meters. It eats a large quantity of squid. Animals that are themselves the product of a deep food web and whose tissues contain iron. It cannot defecate at depth in any useful way for the surface because it does not stay there. It has to come back up to breathe, and it defecates near the surface, in the sunlit layer, releasing iron-rich liquid waste directly into the exact zone where iron is the thing standing between the phytoplankton and growth. That is not a metaphor. That is a pump. Biomass goes in at a kilometer down, and fertilizer comes out in the light, and the machinery driving it is the animal's own need for air. A 2010 study in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B put numbers on it for the Southern Ocean. The authors estimated that sperm whales there defecate on the order of 50 tons of iron into the photic zone each year. They estimated the resulting stimulation of new primary production drives the export of around 400,000 tons of carbon per year to the deep ocean, against roughly 200,000 tons respired by the whales themselves. The conclusion that falls out of that should stop you. The population of around 12,000 sperm whales in the Southern Ocean, on those estimates, functions as a net carbon sink, removing more carbon from the atmosphere than it adds. Every part of that is an estimate, and the paper presents it as such. Population figures, defecation rates, iron content, the efficiency with which stimulated growth actually exports carbon downward rather than being recycled at the surface. Every one of those inputs carries uncertainty, and the field continues to refine them. The magnitude is debated. The direction is not. Deep-feeding, surface-breathing whales move nutrients upward against gravity, and upward is the direction the surface ocean needs. Now finish the loop and pay attention to where it ends, because this is the part that reorganizes the entire comparison. Iron in the photic zone stimulates phytoplankton. Phytoplankton feed zooplankton. Zooplankton feeds small fish. Small fish feed larger fish. Larger fish feed salmon and seals, and everything else in the sunlit band. Which feed orcas? The animal that cannot enter the deep is, in part, eating the output of a process run by the animal that lives there. That is not a poetic flourish, and it should not be oversold. No single species runs an ocean, and the whale pump is one contribution among many in a system with countless nutrient pathways. But the direction of the relationship is real, and the direction is the opposite of what the ranking implies. The predator we crowned consumes the system. The animal we cast as prey helps fertilize it. And there is a historical footnote to this that is almost too neat to be true, except that it is documented, and it is the reason the industry existed at all. We killed sperm whales for their oil, hundreds of thousands of them. We burned the spermaceti from their heads in lamps, and we used it to lubricate the machines of an industrial revolution that was, at the very same time, beginning to load the atmosphere with carbon. The animal we rendered into lamp oil was, on the best current estimates, part of the system pulling carbon back down. The whaling era removed a large fraction of that machinery from the ocean. What the ocean lost when the whales went is an active area of research, and the numbers are argued over, but the accounting runs in one direction. Fewer deep-feeding, surface-breathing giants means less iron delivered upward, means less production in iron-limited water, means less carbon exported to depth. We did not just kill a lot of animals. We turned off part of a pump and then burned what we took out of it, which exposes what the word apex was doing all along, and it was never doing the job we assigned it. Apex predator is a technical term with a narrow, defensible meaning, an animal that nothing else routinely eats. By that definition, the orca qualifies cleanly, and so does the sperm whale, because predation on adult sperm whales is rare enough that neither species has a meaningful natural predator. What happened is that the technical term got promoted. It stopped meaning nothing eats this and started meaning this is the best one, the strongest one, the top of the ocean. And the moment a ranking word gets applied to an environment, it starts smuggling in an assumption about which parts of that environment were counted. We counted the part we can see. Consider what a fair audit would actually have to include, and how little of it we have. To rank two animals in the ocean, you would need comparable data on both, across their entire range, through their whole lives. For orcas, we have something close to that in a handful of populations. Individually identified animals photographed for decades, genealogies, diet studies, acoustic recordings, health assessments. Some killer whale populations are among the best documented wild animals on Earth. For sperm whales, we have fragments. We have what tags record over days or weeks. We have what strands on beaches. We have stomach contents from animals killed by an industry that stopped decades ago. We have acoustic recordings from hydrophones. We have the logbooks of the men who hunted them, which are, absurdly, still one of our better long-term data sets on the species. What we do not have is the thing that would matter most: sustained observation of a sperm whale doing the thing a sperm whale mostly does. Almost the entire working life of this animal, the hunting, the finding, the capturing, the navigating, whatever passes for social interaction at depth, happens in a place where we have almost never watched it. We have essentially been rating a night shift worker on the 10 minutes a day we see them stepping outside for air. And the honest list of what remains unresolved is longer than most people would guess, which is the opposite of what a comparison video usually admits. We do not know with confidence how deep they can actually go, because the record depths come from a small number of tagged animals and a handful of indirect measurements, and the deepest claims sit at the edge of what the data can support. We do not know how they locate prey with the precision the buzz rate implies. We do not fully know how they capture it, with suction feeding still a strong inference rather than a demonstrated mechanism. We do not know what the coda repertoires are actually carrying. Structure has been documented, meaning has not been decoded, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. We do not know whether the forehead is genuinely used as a ram, only that a model says it could survive being used as one. We do not know how the buoyancy question resolves. We do not know how much the population has recovered from whaling or how fast, because there is no way to census a species that is almost never at the surface. We do not know what rising ocean noise is doing to a species that navigates, hunts, and maintains its entire social structure through sound in an ocean that gets louder every year with shipping. That last one deserves a moment because it is the one that connects the whole thing back to us. An animal whose survival depends on hearing faint echoes in a quiet ocean is now living in an ocean that is not quiet. The consequences are being studied and are not fully understood. Uncertainty in that direction is not comforting. So the ranking was never a measurement. It was a reflection of where our cameras could go, and a reasonable person looking at the same evidence today would arrive somewhere different. Not at orcas being weak. That reading would be lazy and wrong, and everything documented about them argues against it. Nothing in the sea coordinates a hunt the way killer whales do. Their culture is real. Their teaching is real. Their techniques are refined across generations, and their coordination in the moment is better than anything the sperm whale does. Put an orca pod and a sperm whale group in the same 50 meters of water, and the orcas are the more dangerous animal in that 50 meters. That is the crown. It is genuine. It is also, measured against the volume of the ocean, an extremely small kingdom, and the qualities that make them so effective inside it. The specialization, the tight, small populations, the coastal range, the position at the top of a long food chain, are the same qualities that leave them exposed in ways the animal below them is not. The thing we called the top was a species living in the thinnest, most crowded, most contaminated, most human-adjacent slice of the sea, brilliant at exploiting it, and structurally vulnerable because of exactly that brilliance. And the thing we cast as prey, the gray blob in the children's book, the harpooned victim, the lamp oil, turns out to be the largest toothed predator alive on the planet, making the loudest sound produced by any animal on Earth, carrying on average the heaviest brain of any animal alive, hunting in a place where sunlight has never reached, in every ocean on the planet, defended by a formation that costs its enemies more than the meal is worth, running a society organized into dialect-bounded clans that span ocean basins, and moving nutrients upward through the water column in quantities large enough to show up in the carbon accounting of the Southern Ocean. Sit with the last one, because it is the reframe that actually matters. The apex predator eats the ecosystem. The sperm whale is partly running it. Those are not the same kind of animal, and only one of them is measurable by counting kills. Here is the image to keep. A sperm whale hanging vertically in blue water. Nose up, tail down, motionless. Not swimming, not clicking, not hunting. Just suspended there in the light. Asleep, in a posture no other animal on Earth adopts, for a few minutes stolen out of a day that has no room in it. Around it, a few others in the same pose, spaced out like standing stones. Then it wakes. It rolls forward. It drops. Watch it go. And watch how fast the light stops helping. 50 meters, and the color is draining. 100, and it is a shape. 200, the depth where an orca's everyday world has already ended, and the last usable sunlight is going with it, and the animal is a gray smudge. 300, and there is nothing. No shape, no shadow, no direction, just water that keeps going down for another 3.5 kilometers. It will be gone for the better part of an hour, at a pressure that would kill you in the time it takes to notice, in cold that never varies, in a dark that has never once been interrupted, screaming into the black at a volume nothing else in nature can produce, and reading the answers as they come back. And then it will come up, breathe for 9 minutes, and do it again. Hold the frame on the empty water where it went in. Now put the orca's entire world back into that shot. The whole kingdom, every hunt, every technique, every piece of footage that ever made the case, it fits in the bright band at the top of the frame. That is not a story about one animal being better than another. It is a story about what happens when you rank a planet by the part of it you can film. The ocean did not put orcas on top. We did, from a boat, in daylight, looking down at the only few meters we could see. The rest of it is still down there, mostly unwatched, running on rules we have barely started to write down, and the largest toothed predator in it has been solving problems we did not even know were problems for longer than there have been people to be impressed by it. We just never went deep enough to notice.